Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast, Erd Steppas Academy. Today we're going to be talking about literary criticism, and for today's episode we are going to stick mostly to the 20th century. Now we're going to be covering a lot of things in this episode, so don't hesitate if you need to watch this episode more than once, or pause it and take some notes and then start it again. A lot of this is going to be things that are going to be used a lot, though, in future episodes. And so as we actually apply these criticisms, they will be much easier to see how they work. So for today, though, we're going to stick to the 20th century. We will be doing criticism, literary theory, pre-20th century, but a lot of that will be handled in the philosophy sections. For example, some of the earliest literary theories come from Aristotle's Poetics. And so when we get to Aristotle, we'll be covering that criticism from there. There really is a lot of overlap between literature and philosophy, and that's why I teach these two together, why I studied these two together, because you really, once you start getting into it, you will find yourself talking about philosophers when you're studying literature. You'll find yourself talking about, uh, you know, literary people when you're studying philosophy. So, but today we're going to stick to the 20th century. And the first four I'm going to cover are not going to be ones we will use as much, but they are ones that will give you a little bit of an understanding and a foundation. The first one I want to talk about is Russian formalism. Russian formalism was an attempt to make literary theory, literary criticism, much more scientific. This is the beginning of the 20th century, and everyone is trying to move everything towards science. Philosophy, psychology, the hard sciences, even literature is all trying to move towards being more systematic and scientific when they analyze a piece of literature. And so the Russian formalists, their main focus was the novel. And when you look at Russian formalism, some of the questions they have are, what's the difference between a novel and a biography or an autobiography? What's the difference between a novel and a history book? They're looking for what are the specific features that make something a novel. Now, some of their ideas will be things that you will have heard probably in high school or college courses. Things like a plot line. You have the initial incident, you have the rising action, you have the climax in the action, and then the things slow down to a resolution, and then the novel's elements are resolved. Other things that they talk about are narrator. Who's telling the story? Is it a first-person narrator that says, this is what happened to me? Example of this would be Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. First person telling the story. Another possibility is the third-person narrative. Now, the third-person narrative can have different levels of narrative. Third person is somebody on the outside telling the story. You can have a third-person narrator who is omniscient, who knows everything. They know the thoughts of each of the characters. They know all of the action. Or you can have a third-person narrator that is limited, in which case they can't necessarily get into the heads of each of the characters. They get into the heads of some of them, or maybe not even at all, and just tell you, what is the action going on. I should add, with first-person narrator, you have different levels in the first-person narrator as well. You have a first-person narrator that seems to be reliable, and then you have a first-person narrator who is unreliable. If you think about, some of Edgar Allan Poe's stories, where you have this narrator who is obviously not mentally well. How much can you trust what a narrator tells you when they don't even have a good grasp of reality? So when you're looking at some of those narrators, you have to wonder, how much of this is real and how much of this is not real. And we are going to get into the sound and the fury, and we're going to use a lot of analysis in that, because there's a lot of places that analysis can go. It covers a lot of different areas. And so we will get into that, probably have quite a few episodes just on that novel. The Russian formalists are pretty much dissolving around 1919. And if you wonder why, look at the name. They're Russian formalists. They're in Russia. And what happens around 1919 in Russia? You have the Communist Revolution. And so a lot of the writers of Russian formalism who stayed in Russia were told, you write pro-Soviet propaganda or we shoot you. So most of them who stayed wrote pro-Soviet propaganda. A few of them fled the country and continued to do some work, but the bulk of the work of the Russian formalists was before the Russian Revolution. Now, like I said, when you studied literature in high school, you probably used a lot of these ideas. You used the idea of, the plot line, the type of narrator. And so these are not ideas that are too new, or shouldn't be anyway, hopefully. The next group that comes along are the new critics. The new critics are coming along about in the 1920s, just after the Russian formalists. The new critics, though, have a little bit different focus. Instead of focusing on novels, the new critics focus on poetry. Most of their criticism is about poetry, and they have a couple of things on their agenda. One of them is they want to come up with what is the one right way of reading a particular poem, so that when everybody reads the poem, everybody should have the same interpretation. That's one of their ideas. Another one of their ideas is that there are certain poems that qualify as literature and other ones that qualify as something else. Now, this is a group of white male Europeans and Americans, so as you can imagine, most of their canon, which is their section of literature they see as being authentically literature and not something else, you're going to see mostly white male European and American authors, and even not very many Americans. Only a few Americans really make it into the canon of being, what they consider literary authors. Part of what's going on with the new critics is they are in the 1920s, and I don't know if you remember, we talked about the forms of literature and how they changed. The 1920s was after World War I. It was, the start of, people starting to have their faith shaken in the progress of humanity. And so the new critics tended to be very, very conservative. They look to the older works of literature and the older styles of literature as being, those are the ones that are the right ones. Those are the ones that are the best ones, because they feel they're living in a world where, everything is falling apart, and they're trying to kind of hold on to something. If you can't hold on to the idea of progress, if you can't hold on to the idea of patriotism, or, science, or religion, because that even seemed to be on shaky grounds with, we'd gone through Darwinism and, some of the advances of science, they felt maybe literature, poetry was something they could, at least keep that sacred. They did bring us a few elements of analysis that are still used in a lot of, especially high school and early college classes. The ideas of a close reading. When you read a poem, what it says in the poem is all you should take into consideration. What it says is what it means. You don't think about what the author thought about it. You don't think about any kind of historical context outside of that. They saw it as being a work of art complete in itself. And this is how they figured they could get the one right reading of that poem. They do introduce things like, scanning the lines, seeing, the type of number of syllables. What is the rhyme scheme? What is, the stanza pattern? Is it a sonnet? Is it a, villanelle? Which, don't worry if you don't know these terms. These are terms we will talk about in future episodes. And so they were trying to get to what is, the structure of poetry, the same way the Russian formalists were trying to get to what is the structure of novels. So that was their main focus. As time goes on, we move into the 40s and 50s. Literary criticism starts to pick up some other schools, and one of them is the structuralists. And the structuralists by far were linguists. Most of them were experts in language, in grammar, in vocabulary, word usage, and they wanted to apply these methods so that they could get the right reading. The new critics started them on this path, but they figured with using the analysis of the grammar, the analysis of word usage at the time when the work was written, then they could come up with the meaning that no one could question. Once they settled the meaning of, this is what this sonnet by Shakespeare means, everyone has to agree that that's what it means. And there's another group that kind of influences them. It's the group known as the hermeneutics. Hermeneutic criticism basically starts out as biblical criticism. It starts out at looking at the scriptures and trying to figure out, what did the words mean at the time it was written, not what do they mean now. Because one of the things that happens is a word changes over time. Just because it means something now does not mean that's what it meant when it was written. And I can give you a concrete example of this from English. In modern English, if you use the word weird, it means strange, bizarre, out of the ordinary. But if you look at Old English and Middle English, and they use the word weird, that word didn't mean strange, it meant fate. So in an Old English poem, you might see the line, weird was set fast. In other words, the fate was fixed. The person's fate was fixed. It could not be changed. So this is one of the things that the structuralists and the hermeneutic critics tried to do, was to get to what did those words mean at that time. And so they would look at not only the structure of the grammar, but they would try to look at other usages of the word in that time period to kind of construct, okay, during this time when this was written, this word meant this and nothing else. One of the problems that happens, though, is they start to realize that language is very slippery. Language does not convey the meaning that they thought that it did. It doesn't have the one-to-one connection that they would like it to have. Let me give you an example of something. It's a very basic word, tree. If I were to ask all of you to draw a tree, all of you would draw something that looked different. You would draw different kinds of trees. Some of them might be oak trees or willow trees or pine trees or, maple trees. They would all be different. But I asked you to draw a tree. It's just one word, and yet I got all of these different types of trees, some large, some small. I say, okay, let me make it a little more specific. Draw a large pine tree. And, somebody might know what a pine tree is. Somebody might not know what a pine tree is. Somebody's large pine tree might, have a lot of needles. Somebody's large pine tree might be kind of barren, tall with only a few branches. And still, I've only asked you to draw. It's one simple thing I've asked to draw. And that's the problem with language, because whenever you get language, you don't just have the meaning of the words. There's what's known as denotation and connotation. The denotation is the dictionary definition of a word. The connotation, though, is how that word is used, how that word is perceived. And this can vary greatly from person to person. For example, if I say think about trees, some of you that might be very relaxing, very soothing. It might, be something you really enjoy, and it's a pleasant thought. But maybe somebody is from a place that doesn't really have any trees. You're from, prairies or desert or, somewhere where trees just really aren't a part of the landscape. And so you don't really have much association whatsoever. You're like, well, I guess they're those, kind of things that stick out of the ground and have the green stuff on them. You don't have necessarily positive or negative thoughts about them. It's neutral. Going even farther, maybe someone was in a storm where a tree, landed on their house or landed on their car, and they were trapped under the, tree for hours until they could be rescued. For that person, trees might be terrifying. It might be something they're, quake with fear every time they see one. So this is the problem that the structuralists started to run into. Language is not easy one-to-one, and everybody gets the same idea. Now add in the fact that a poem is not just composed of one word, it's composed of lots of words. And so you have to now figure out how all of these words fit together, and you might have as many interpretations of this poem as you have people reading it, because everybody's bringing their own ideas with them. They're bringing their own connotations. They're focusing in on different parts of what they feel are the important parts. For some of them, the poem might have some, deep personal meaning, and they may feel a real connection to it. Others might be, okay, it's some lines, they're kind of cute, but it doesn't really do anything for me. So the structuralists start to break into another group known as the post-structuralists. And the post-structuralists start to realize that you can't have one definitive meaning of a poem that everyone will read and everyone will get the same meaning, or else they're wrong. They realized it depends on where you're coming from. It depends on, how you view the words that are used in that poem. And so you can have as many poetry meanings as you have readings of our readers. This opens the door for lots of other types of literary criticism. And we're going to focus on 4 in particular for the rest of this lecture. We will be doing some later on, but for a long time we're going to stick with the 4 that I'm going to go into now. The first type of criticism is what's known as psychological criticism. Psychological criticism can attack the work in 3 main ways. One, you can look at a character in the work and see, what would be the psychology behind that character. And this is one of the things we're going to do a lot of, and we're going to do especially in The Sound and the Fury. You see a character, and the character seems to be depressed, or they seem to be reckless, or they seem to be unable to, they have an inability to communicate well with others. And so you start to think of the character almost the way that a psychologist would think of a patient. What is the diagnosis? This character seems to be suffering from depression. This character seems to have, schizophrenia. This character seems to be suffering from anxiety. And what you would do if you were doing this type of criticism is you would actually look up the symptoms and see, what kinds of symptoms are these and what diagnosis does this point to. So it'd be a similar work, as I said, as if you were a psychologist and trying to figure out, why does this person do what they do? Why don't they do other things? Well, because, you make an argument for this or that. Now, just because you make an argument, again, doesn't mean your argument can't be countered. It doesn't mean it can't be, that somebody else can't come up with a different argument. One of the things that we're doing with literary theory is we're using it as a way of exploring the world through exploring literature. And literature can be much broader than what you think. Literature doesn't just have to be a poem or a novel. Literature can be anything that is a text. And by text could be pictures. I did a paper in grad school, uh, psychological criticism of a vending machine that was for fruit juice. And there were no people on the vending machine. It was all pictures of fruit and different images like that. And one of the things that I focused on was that, one, when you look up, what is the meaning of fruit or flowers, you find out that they always symbolize sex. And there's a reason they always symbolize sex. Because if you step back and think about it scientifically, what are fruit and flowers? They are the reproductive organs of plants. That's straight up what they are. They are plant reproductive organs. So in literature and painting, in photography, it has been a tradition that goes way back that, when you see fruit or flowers, they have, sexual meanings behind them. And, this appeals to people on a subconscious level. They know that it's there, but they don't always think about it. So that's one of the routes you can go with psychological criticism, is to think about a character. Another route you might think about is the psychological analysis of the author. What does this say about the author that wrote this work, this poem, this novel, whatever it is? If you have a novel where there's a character that's just brutally mean and just torments everyone and is just a really horrible, nasty person, and this is the main character, and this is what the novel is based around. What does that tell you about the psychology of the author? You also have to think about, how is this person being portrayed? Is that nasty behavior being portrayed as something that is good and gets them what they want? Is it being portrayed as something that you should find repulsive? If it's a behavior that's being portrayed as something good that's pretty nasty, you might wonder, is this unconsciously what the author wants, unconsciously what the author looks for? Or if they're showing this, and giving you the sense that this is a terrible thing, they might be, showing something that they see and saying, look at how horrible this is. So they might be someone who's experienced something like that from the end of being a victim, or they may be somebody who used to have those traits and has reformed themselves. So you can also go into the psychology of the author. And again, whenever you do these, you are going to want to do research. You don't want to just say, oh, I think they're this. What you want to do is you want to do research. What are the symptoms and signs of that particular ailment that you think? And then list every time you see that. Something happens once, it's not very likely that it's showing something. But when this idea keeps popping up over and over again in this piece of writing, it tends to make you lean towards, okay, this is possibly, what this is getting at psychologically. One of the things that is difficult, and most people won't do with psychological criticism, is you can look at yourself and say, what does my attitude towards this say about me psychologically? You're watching a horror movie where people are being violently ripped apart and tortured and screaming, and it's gore and blood and just misery, and you think this is the best thing you've ever seen. What does this say about your own psychology? Do you have obviously some underlying anger issues that are being repressed? And so these are things that you might look into in a psychological criticism. With all of these criticisms, you do want to think about not just how it strikes you, but does this seem to play out in the real world? And this is where the research often comes in. This is where looking up things often comes in. As you get more familiar with using these types of criticisms, you actually will see patterns that you researched in one work, and these patterns are appearing in this other work by this other person. Or they might be appearing in other works by the same author. But you always want to keep in mind that you're doing this with an idea of not only you're analyzing the text, but you're analyzing things about the real world. You're analyzing things about human behavior when you're doing psychological. The next one I want to go into is feminist criticism. Now, feminist criticism is, I'm going to have to like really narrow this for our purposes. We will get into some more advanced things later, but feminist criticism is a very wide field, and some of it is very much involved in linguistics and talking about what kinds of languages, what kinds of words are feminine words versus masculine words. What kinds of words are something that a male would typically describe something as, or what kinds would a female typically, and what kinds of words would somebody be who would be more in the middle. So some of it can be very complex. We're not going to get into the linguistics, not for a long time. We're going to stick to some of the bigger issues in feminist criticism. One of them is voice. Who has the voice? Is it the male characters? Is it the female characters? Does one gender or the other have the voice? Do they have all the voice on one side or the other? Is it slightly balanced? What is the voice that you get when you read this work? As I said before, we're going to be doing the sound and the fury, and one of the things about the sound and the fury is you have 4 different characters telling the same story. There's 4 siblings in the family, 3 brothers and a sister. The sister plays a very important role in all of what goes on, but she does not get a section. Each of the brothers have a section that they tell their version of what's going on, and then the 4th section is by a third-person narrator. We never get to hear the actual voice of the female character. Her voice is only given through the lens of the male characters. Also, when it comes to voice, you may see female characters in a male-driven narrative, or male characters in a female-driven narrative, where when they speak, they're kind of just dismissed. And they're not given any major lines. They're just sort of there as a plot device, as something to move along things for what seem to be pushed forward as the important voices. So whose voice is not only heard or represented, but whose voice actually gets heard when it is represented. Do the female and male characters both say important things, or do you have, for example, male characters talking about all the important ideas, and you have a female character that has very superficial things like, oh, what shall we have for dinner? This is something that a feminist critic would look at. How is the voice represented? Another thing that feminist criticism might look at is power. Which gender has the power? Is it completely one-sided? Is it a patriarchy where the males have all the power? Is it a matriarchy where the females have all the power? You can have stories that are, the author can set them up any way they want. And also, when you look at who has the power, look at how this is presented. So you may have a very patriarchal system where the males have all the power in the system, and it might be portrayed as just normal. This is just the way things are. This is just the way things should be. And so when you see that, you know that the attitude that it's pushing forth, not only is that it's patriarchal, but that's the way it should be, or vice versa. It could be matriarchal, and that's the way it should be. Or are they presenting a patriarchal or matriarchal society, and the way they're presenting it is as a criticism? For example, if you have female characters that are in a patriarchal society who keep telling the male characters, well, this is the solution, and is a solution that would work, but the male characters are just kind of, oh, no, no, you're a woman, you don't know what you're talking about, and, go off into, catastrophe on their own, you'll kind of get the feeling that while the story may be in a patriarchal society, it may be a criticism of that society. This is something you have to look at with all of these types of criticisms and with literature, period. What is the literature putting out there? Just because it puts out a certain element, puts out a certain idea, doesn't necessarily mean that it's saying hooray for that idea. It could be saying, look at this, isn't this terrible? Or it could be saying, look at this, isn't it wonderful? This is something that you have to keep in mind when we're talking, and we'll bring these things up. Does it seem like the author is, when they present something saying, yeah, look, this is great, this is the way it should be, or the author is presenting something and go, don't you see how stupid this is? Don't you see how bad this is? I do. So power is another thing that a feminist critic might bring into the analysis. Feminist criticism may also talk about things like the male gaze. Now, this is an idea where often in society women are put out there to be just seen as objects for the attraction of men. Um, you know, how are the women in the story or in the movie or in the show being portrayed? Are they just there to be, looked at, to be wanted, but not really adding anything to the plot? They're just there to be turned into, something for the entertainment of men. Um, this is an idea that we'll go into in more depth in other episodes too, the idea of the male gaze. Um, Also, a feminist criticism will look at gender issues and how the prevailing attitudes of the society not only determine the way things are, but often can also be very damaging and devastating. And this is true for the way female characters are analyzed, but also the way male characters are analyzed. How does gender play a role in what's going on? If you have very bright women in the story or the poem that they're just there for the amusement of the men, what does this do to those females? What does it do to them psychologically? It devastates them. It says, doesn't matter what you have inside, it just matters your outside. How much does this affect them negatively? Same thing. If you have, male characters, how much do the, having to live up to the stereotypes of men of a culture limit the male characters? And I can give you an example of, things like real life. Women in a lot of cultures are expected to be beautiful. Um, Look at how much money is in the cosmetic industry. Billions and billions of dollars are spent on cosmetics, and not just makeup, cosmetic surgery. The idea that what a woman should be is this stereotypical image. How damaging is it to women when they see that, all of these images in television and movies of these, women with perfect hair and perfect teeth and perfect skin and at a perfect weight, and then they look at themselves and say, that's not me. And they see that the women in these movies and shows and, books are the ones that end up happy. And the women that are more plain looking end up in comedy roles, or they end up as, the wicked stepsister, the ugly stepsister, the villain. So how much of this gets internalized? And a feminist critic would look at this. How much does this damage the self-esteem of a woman when she looks at what the media and keeps putting out and saying this is what you're supposed to be, and then she looks at herself and is not perfect. Well, I got news for you. The women that they're putting out are not perfect either. They have, lighting experts, makeup experts, hair experts, wardrobe, and if that doesn't work, they fix them with the computer. They digitally change and alter their looks so that they look like they want them to look. They also have personal trainers and all of these things. This is an image that even those women don't look like that. but the idea gets pushed that you must look like this or else you're not as good. And this is devastating you know, for women. It's devastating for women that feel they have to live up to that. Now, on the opposite side with the men, there are lots of, you know, images that, men are supposed to be this that are just as devastating to men. Men are never supposed to, if you watch the movies, they're never supposed to be uncertain. A man should know what he's doing at every moment, and that's not the way reality is. How should a man solve his issues? Well, he, you know, has to solve his issues if you look at especially movies geared towards men, either with his fists, with guns, with knives, with swords, with, whatever. It has to be, feelings are something, and conflicts are something that must be settled physically with violence. Um, this is something that puts unrealistic ideas into men's heads, how they should behave. You know, Men in the movies are just like women in the movies. They're pretty much going to be always good looking in the dramas or in the, action movies. They're going to be attractive people. So when you're a man and you don't look like that, what does that do to your self esteem? You're not as much of a man. Well, the fact is, these men aren't that much of men either. They have personal trainers, they have, again, lighting, wardrobe, makeup, all of these experts that make them look this way, special effects. And so it creates, especially when you're dealing with mass media, um, these gender, I guess you'd call them ideals, create issues that are devastating to both men and women. When you have these issues, when you see this is what a woman is supposed to be, or this is what a man is supposed to be, and you're not that, it can cause depression. And, extreme cases, it can cause, eating disorders or, even suicide or suicide attempts. One of the statistics that's been true for a long time is that although women attempt suicide more frequently, men are more successful. Why is that? Because of the methods of suicide usually attempted. For women, it's generally pills or drowning or something where there's a possibility that they can be saved. For women, it's a cry for help. For men are taught by society that you got to do it yourself. If you can't make it on your own, then you just need to get out and die. That if you're not everything you're supposed to be, you can't ask for help, you can't cry, you can't be weak, you just have to kill yourself. So when men attempt suicide, it's not a cry for help, it's I failed, and you know it's time to end it. So men hang themselves, shoot themselves, jump off a building, crash their car into a tree at 100 miles an hour. And these are all ideas that feminist critics would look at, and a feminist criticism would look at. It's like, how do these, gender voices, power, portrayals, how do they all play out, um, in what's going on, but also how does that affect people in real life? How does that affect people in the real world? So we'll be doing feminist criticisms on in the future too on a lot of things. The next one I want to talk about is Marxist criticism. Now, people might say, "Oh, Marxist criticism, that makes you a communist." No, Marxist criticism doesn't necessarily have to do with communism. Yes, there would be Marxist criticisms that would be criticizing like capitalist societies. You could have works that are portraying capitalist societies in negative light. But you could also do Marxist criticisms on communist societies, socialist societies, feudal societies, because Marxist criticism looks at two main things. It looks at what is the social structure. Is it tribal? Is it tribes that were hunter-gatherers? Is it feudal system? Is it capitalism? Is it communism? Is it socialism? Is it anarchism? What is the political system going on, and how does that determine behavior? Let me give you an example. If you're reading a story that's set in the time of the feudal system. You have a peasant standing alongside the road, and a nobleman walks up and slaps him in the face and says, "Be here tomorrow so I can slap you again." And then the next day in the story, the peasant's standing there waiting to be slapped. Why is that? Well, because under feudalism, if the peasant were to strike the nobleman back, that would be, that would be something that would get the peasant executed or imprisoned at the very least, probably for the rest of their life, and tortured. There are certain things that you just can't do under different political systems. So when you're looking at, well, why does a character behave this way? Why don't they just do it this way? What you're often doing is putting your own system, the way you live, onto people that would not really understand that system. So a Marxist criticism would look at whatever political system they're in, and how much does that shape behavior. In a system where there's social mobility, you might look at a character that's poor and say, well, why don't they just work harder and become wealthy, or become at least wealthier? Well, depending on the system they're in, if the feudal system, you're born what you are. You're born a peasant, you die a peasant. You're born a slave, you die a slave. You're born nobility, you die nobility. You're born royalty, you die royalty. There is no social mobility. It doesn't matter how hard you work or don't work. Where you're born is where you stay. How come a character in a novel set in a feudal system, the second born son has to join the military or the church? How come they can't just, inherit their part of the property and live happily ever after and do what they want? Because under the feudal system, only the oldest son could inherit the property. They did this because they didn't. Wealth was based on property, and they didn't want property to become smaller and smaller with each generation. So, for example, if you have a large estate and you have 5 sons, now in the next generation there are 5 smaller estates, and they each have 5 sons, and now there's 25 smaller estates, and so the wealth would just disappear. So it was written into the laws that the firstborn son got everything. The secondborn, thirdborn, fourthborn, they had nothing. Their only options were to go into the military, or go into the church, become a priest or a monk. This is part of the reason that if you look at some of the abuses in the early Catholic Church, because a lot of the people that went into the church weren't very religious. They went into the church because they didn't want to go to war, and that was their only option if they wanted to eat. Also, if you look at stories from that time period, you have a man who has a bunch of daughters and no sons. There's a huge push for these daughters to get married to someone who will take care of them. Why? Because they can't inherit the property. Whoever is the next male in line is going to be the one that gets the property. The daughters will get nothing, so they have to be married off to men who are of good station. Also, marriage period, even if you are the firstborn, they were often arranged in those time periods. Why? Because if you're very wealthy and have a large estate and a son, and your neighbor is very wealthy and has a large estate and has a daughter, you want to marry them together because you're combining the family names. You're combining and becoming more wealthy by moving up the ladder. So they look at the economic system and how it dictates, the way people behave. Also, class. How does social class affect things? Is it a society where there's class mobility? So the person might move up or down. Is it a society where there's no class mobility? But also, what are the relationships between those classes? Where are the conflicts? A large part of Marxism is the belief in history is kind of the long tale of the struggle of the classes between each other. So a Marxist criticism might look at class and how that affects things. Also just your social class. If you're upper class, you're going to have, depending on the time period, probably some education. Whether you're ever going to use it or not doesn't mean anything, but you probably will have to go to college. Or go to a university or have private tutors. If you are a peasant, there's no expectation you'll ever be educated at all. You'll learn farming from your father, and you'll be a farmer, or whatever your family trade is. Okay, the next one I want to go into is cultural. Cultural criticism can look at other things like religion. How does religion play a part in what's going on? If you have a story that's set in an Islamic culture, you're going to have to kind of know some things about Islam to know why are the characters doing the things they do. Why do they believe the things they do? If it's set in a Christian culture, you have to know, why, what are some of the religious things that determine why they're doing the things they're doing. So a cultural criticism, one of the things that we'll look at is religion within the culture. Is the person following all the rules and doing what they're supposed to according to the religion, or are they breaking the rules and being a bad person according to the religion? But also remember, there is the way that it is portrayed. You might have the person following all the rules and being rewarded, and that person is portrayed in a very negative light, and that is probably making a criticism of the religion of the culture and saying, bad people win. What they paint to be bad people, if they follow these rules they're supposed to, they're going to win. And it may be a very negative thing. Or it may, show them following the rules and winning and saying, see, if everybody just does what they're supposed to, it works well. So as you're looking at this, always think about how not only what the religion or the culture or the gender or the psychology, how that shapes things, but how is it being portrayed? Is it something positive? Is it something negative? Also in cultural criticism, you may have more than one culture, so you may have conflicts. You might have a mainstream culture and then a subculture, and how do those cultures get along or not get along? Cultural criticism will look at a lot of things. Cultural criticism sometimes gets a bad reputation in literary theory because it will often look at things, as I was talking about, that most people would not consider literature, but a cultural critic would look at that. So for example, a cultural critic might study television commercials. What does a television commercial tell you about the culture? How do the actors or actresses look? Is humor something? Is it you're supposed to be funny? Are you supposed to, be beautiful or handsome? Is having the best of the best important? What is being stressed? And a lot of times people don't realize that a lot of their own values are really shaped by things that they don't think of as literature, things that they think of as just, well, this is just, it's a TV commercial, or it's a billboard, or it's a, it's a romantic comedy, or it's, just a television show or a movie. None of these things are without philosophies. None of these things are just innocently portraying things. Because if you analyze them, which we will be analyzing stuff like that, you'll realize there are things that they're pushing. Certain looks will be rewarded or punished. Certain behaviors are rewarded or punished. And this is subtle. This doesn't have to be in your face. Just think about how the characters look. When you're looking at something that's a drama or a romance or even an action movie, how do the people who are heroes, how do they look? Are they beautiful? Are they handsome? Are they, athletic? Are they, if they're a female character, are they submissive? And then the bad female character is the one that's, would be, they portray her as pushy or arrogant. These things are all very much a part of how people shape their philosophies. And it's very subtle, but it's very effective. If you don't believe that, take a look at how much American culture, just American culture, changed between the 40s and the 50s. And all of this had to do with advertising. Prior to the 1950s, most Americans lived in a multi-generational home. You had a couple that would buy a house, have children. The children would become older. One of the children would take over the house. The couple would retire to be the grandparents, and then their child would raise the grandchildren there. So you would have multi generations living in the home. This is still the case in a lot of countries around the world, but it also used to be the case in the United States. Most homes were multi generational. You didn't move out and get your own house when you turned 18. You stayed, you helped. If your family had a lot of land, they might build you a house. If you were farmers, you might get some acres for each of the children, and they would build a farm, but each would have their own house. But everybody stayed pretty much in the same house as long as there was room. Well, why did this change in the 50s? After the Depression, after World War II, they needed a way to get the economy going again. If you've ever moved into a new house or a new apartment for the first time, you realize there's nothing there. There's no furniture, there's no dishes, there's no curtains or rugs or anything. Everything you buy, pictures on the wall. And so it was a way of stimulating the economy. Don't take over your parents' house, because when you take over the house that your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents have lived in, you don't need furniture and dishes and drapes and all of these things, because it's already there. Yeah, you might have to replace items here or there, but you don't have to buy it all new. In the 50s, they wanted to stimulate the economy, so they told people, you can't live with your parents, you got to move out. The idea of the nuclear family. Family should be mom, dad, children, dog. And then when the children grow up, they should move out and get their own homes. Because selling brand new homes not only stimulates the economy by buying the houses, you got to buy all the stuff that goes in it. So it was a way of stimulating the economy. Also, prior to advertising, Americans didn't bathe every day. Americans used to take what was known as the Saturday night bath. They would take a bath once a week, Saturday night, so they would be clean for church on Sunday morning. And it was just the way the culture was. But through advertising, people were taught that this is disgusting, this is terrible, you shouldn't be this way. And the funny thing is, the thing that really got this going were what were called soap operas, what are still called soap operas, or daytime dramas. And the reason they were called soap operas was that soap companies would sponsor them. So they would put on these shows, these dramas for housewives, because at the time most of the women were, in the home and the men were working. And they would gear these shows to women, and they would fill them with commercials about laundry soap and dish soap and shampoo and body soap and all of these things, and basically pounded into people's heads that, oh, you don't want to be the stinky family, buy our laundry detergent. You don't want to be the stinky, family, buy our body wash, or body soap, or our shampoo. And in a very short amount of time, American culture changed from the Saturday night bath being, typical, to people bathing daily. Now, you can make arguments about whether this was a good thing or a bad thing, but the reality is that it was never presented as, oh, this is healthier, and there was never a discussion about whether it was healthier or not. There was never that idea put to the families. The idea that was put out there was through manipulating the emotions. One of the things we'll talk about is logical fallacies in the future. So all of these things a cultural critic would look at, and they look at things that are often beyond what other literary critics would look at, and they think about how do these images, how do these ideas, how do these songs, how do these movies shape the way people believe, shape the way they behave, and when you don't look at things and analyze them, you tend to be pushed down paths and you don't know how you got there. You don't know why you're there. And that's because you were subtly pushed down those paths. As you become more uh, in tune with doing literary criticism, with doing philosophical analysis, you can step back and look at the things you're doing, look at the things you believe and say, is this really me? You know, how many times have you worked really hard for something because that's what you wanted? You thought this was it. This is, you know, what I want. When I get this, I'm going to be happy. Whether it's a job, whether it's a, you know, a car, whatever it is, piece of clothing, piece of jewelry, and you get it, and you are like, okay, I don't really like this. And what usually has gone on at that point is that somebody has, somebody being society, not one person in particular, but you know, the people that want to sell you things, the political leaders, your family, your friends, have all put into your head that this is who you are, this is what you should want, and you should work for that. When you step back and look at these things, you might look at them and go, that's nice if people want that, but that's not what I want. That's not what's going to make me happy. And so one of the things that, as we do these, you know, podcasts, whether it's philosophy or literature, always keep in mind that you are using this towards not only thinking about literature, thinking about philosophy, but applying it to your life, applying it to the world. You know, getting a better grasp of the way things are and why they are the way they are. And is it necessary for them to be the way they are? Or have we just, you know, said, well, you know, this is kind of what everybody says it's going to be and what it is, so I guess this is what it is. A lot of the things that people think that are uh, inevitable, that people think this is the way they are and there's nothing that can be done about it, are simply what they've been led to believe. And so through these podcasts, whether we're philosophy, literature, or even the grammar podcasts, we're going to be talking about this stuff and applying it to the real world. Because philosophy was never meant, and literature were never things that were meant to be studied in a university by people who are, you know, isolated from the real world. The original philosophers, the original literary writers, and even those up through today that are the ones that are producing, you know, great ideas and great works, are the ones that live in the real world. And they look at the real world and they say, I'm not quite sure if this is the way it has to be. What if we do it this way? What if we try it this way? And so they are people who are looking for the better life. They are people that are looking for, you know, how do we, you know, live not only a better life, but a happier life, but also a life that allows us to interact better with others. So one of the things about philosophy and literature is, yes, while there's this often focus on the individual, there's also a focus on society and what is the individual's place in society. We are dualistic creatures. We are individual and we are social. And you know, these podcasts are going to be exploring ways that humans have, you know, for thousands of years been thinking about, you know, how do I live a successful life for me? How do I live a happy life for me? And how do I make that work within society? Or do I just, some of them come to the conclusion that they should just turn their back on society? And we'll be looking at some of those writers as well. Okay, I want to break off there, but I do want to talk a little bit about the upcoming podcasts. The next one will be a podcast on diagramming sentences. I'm going to try to keep putting those in there. I usually list those as being for children, but they're not really. The reason I do that is because they're something that is for all ages. They're not necessarily. I'm not going to be doing things that are just for children, but they're things that children can grasp because it is grammar and it is looking at how sentences work together, words work together into sentences. It also is something for adult audiences that will help you with logic, because if you want to work on logic and, analysis of ideas, a good place to start is often the analysis of the language you're speaking, because, we talked about how slippery language can be. Well, if word choice is slippery and you have to be very careful about your word choice, you're going to find out that grammar can make it even more slippery. So not using precise grammar can make it even harder for you to understand or to be understood. So the next episode will be about diagramming. We're going to do the type 2 sentences, review type 1. And the episode on that, we're going to stick with literary theory for the next episode. And we're going to be talking about a poem called Porphyria's Lover by Robert Browning. Now I'm going to put that into the comments, so before you come to that episode, which should be out next week, I would recommend, going online, finding it. You can find it online easily. It's for free. You just have to search under the name and it'll pop up under quite a few different free websites. But read through it, and we're going to be actually applying the psychological, the feminist, the Marxist, and the cultural criticisms to that poem. So it's going to give you a little bit of a sense of how these things that we talked about today, how it actually goes into how do we analyze an actual work. Okay, I hope all of you are doing well, and I hope all of you are staying safe. I will talk to you soon. Have a good day.